And thanks so much for those top crime stories. Always a lot going on, and we appreciate Anthony's updates on that. All right, let's turn back now to the other main trial that we are focused on here on the Law and Crime Network, and that is the case of Wallace Bradsher. Unlike our usual cases, this is not a murder case. It's not a kidnapping case, but it is definitely an interesting case, especially if you're into alleged corrupt politicians. I'm here with Vincent Hill, one of our Law and Crime trial analysts, and also one of the hosts. And great background there. What sky is that? The Atlanta skyscape, Vincent?
Actually, it's a New York skyscape in Atlanta. Believe it or not, it's just something I picked up from IKEA.
Very nice. I think it looks very good. Well, we appreciate you joining us. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this case. I know you listened to a lot of the testimony on Friday, especially Friday afternoon. We are still in the prosecution's case. However, the defense is going to put on their case, and by the defense, I mean Wallace Bradsher himself.
Right.
Where could they possibly go with the defense's case in this one?
Well, Rachel, my speculation is that, Bradsher's going to say that he did nothing wrong. You saw in his opening statements, he kind of alluded to that he did nothing wrong. So I think that's what he's going to hammer in here. I mean, we're 6 days into this trial. It went a little longer than I thought it would go, but again, there's the potential of up to 18 years in prison and $48,000, which definitely is nothing to sneeze at. So now I can understand why this trial has been going on for these 6 days now, going into the 7th day.
Why do you think, and this is something I've been trying to figure out from the beginning, that Craig Blitzer, who is that guy you see on the screen right there, who also testified, he basically copped a plea deal, and he got away with basically nothing, right, in terms of criminal penalties. When you look at these two cases, I guess I have not been convinced yet that Bradsher is really kind of the worst one in this scheme. Because usually when prosecutors get someone to turn on another person, it's because they think that person is the mastermind behind the scheme and they want to get the main guy, okay? In this case, are you convinced, Vincent, that Craig's kind of equally as bad as Wallace here? I'm just not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but he did cop to that deal, rather quickly. And of course, that's always a tactic by the prosecution. Hey, let's offer who we consider less culpable the deal so they can actually testify against that other person. But it doesn't necessarily mean his involvement wasn't as serious or as the other person in this case. We just don't know. It hasn't been proven yet.
Yeah, exactly. And you would think by now at this point, we've heard from, the two main witnesses, Craig Blitzer and his wife. We've heard now from the lead investigator, and I'm going to get from the SBI, and I'm going to get to more of that testimony very shortly. But you think we'd start, if we were jurors, right, to have a picture of Wallace Bradsher really being the kind of criminal mastermind, so to speak. And I'm not seeing it yet.
No, I haven't seen it, especially when I was watching his opening statements and what he said during that, and even his cross-examination of some of the witnesses, to include the investigator. I just haven't seen where this guy was this mastermind behind this plan that supposedly took place and started inside of a pizza parlor between Blitzer and Bradsher. I just don't see it yet. I haven't been convinced of that.
The big master plan at the pizza parlor. Okay,
right.
We have a lot to discuss. Vincent's going to be with me for the next hour. But in the meantime, I want us to turn now to some testimony that we heard last week, at the end of last week, and that is from David Whitley, who is with the SBI. And he really was a key investigator in all of this. So let's take a listen. Okay, so we'll continue to listen to more of David Whitley from the SBI's testimony, but first I want to bring in Vincent very quickly. How hard, Vincent, when we have cases like this, sometimes they're a little bit more complicated than your usual case. When, you're dealing with maybe this isn't really a financial crime, but it is because the allegation is that taxpayer money was stolen. But sometimes the investigations can get a little bit more difficult for jurors to understand. The lines aren't as black and white. Someone's dead, someone's alive, someone was kidnapped, someone was not. In this case, it's kind of unclear. Could he have hired his wife, Bradsher, at first? What did the ethics law say? You know, does that make it harder for jurors?
Not only for jurors, Rachel, but keep in mind for an SBI agent, which is a state agent, which is not a local police agent, this is not a typical case. Typically, they're called in to investigate officer-involved shootings, officer misconduct. So even for the investigator, this is a very convoluted and very confusing case, and his job is to prove that a law was broken. So for someone that doesn't do this quite often, as some of his other investigations, it could be quite difficult.
I mean, clearly, you know, you get the feeling when you're either an SBI agent investigating this or a trial watcher or a jury, you get a feeling there's something not right here because, I mean, two prosecutors, each swapping wives, the whole scheme smells wrong. But the question is it against the law? We'll have Vincent stick around with us for a few more minutes. But first, I want us to continue listening to David Whitley's testimony. Okay, Vincent Hill, this is really interesting. Okay, so this is testimony from David Whitley. He's the lead investigator with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. He's investigating Wallace Bradsher, who's on trial. He's this alleged corrupt official who was involved in this scheme to hire the wife of another prosecutor for a no-show job. So this guy Whitley we just heard from, he does public corruption investigations. A couple of interesting things I pulled from that testimony. One is that unlike us common folk, Vincent, apparently if you're a corrupt public official, you are dealt with very nicely. You get a phone call. They don't ambush public officials. So that's good to know in North Carolina. But secondly, he also talked about the fact the first time he called Wallace Bradsher's office, he didn't get a phone call back. What do you make of that?
Well, I think Wallace kind of knew what was going on there, whether it was word of mouth or whether he was worried about something. I think he knew something was going on there. But getting back to the psyche of the jury here, I mean, let's think about this for just a second. This type of stuff happens all the time. Listen, we've all hired a friend of a friend or a relative of a friend to work at our office, right? I've hired people that used to work for me or based on a recommendation for someone else, right? And how many people go to work every day and get paid for work that they actually don't do? So really, if I'm a juror in this situation, I'm thinking, hey, this has happened before. I know someone that's done it. I've known people that have shown up to work that have gotten paid for work they didn't do. So what did he do here?
You mean, what did he do wrong here? Is that you know, what the jurors are going to be asking? Yeah, because you're right. It is, honestly, it is a relatable offense in terms of in the private sector. It's pretty common for you to hire a friend of a friend because you trust them. You know that they're good. But this is a little different because, of course, Cindy Blitzer, who's the wife of the other prosecutor, testified to the fact that she wasn't doing any work. Now, the question in this is, how much did Bradsher know she wasn't doing any work? And that's unclear to me. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think Bradsher knows she was doing nothing? Nada?
I mean, I could only speculate, but I would say no, because, you know, she even testified that she didn't know who she should call for time cards and, you know, this, that, and the other, and she would call him as a last resort. So maybe he was just so far removed from this, Rachel, that he really had no idea what she was or wasn't doing.
That's what I'm thinking, too, because she was very clear in her testimony that she didn't really talk to Bradsher very often. Cindy Blitzer, who you see there on the screen, actually testified to the fact when she needed to reach her boss, Wallace Bradsher, who's on trial, she would go through her husband.
Right.
So now we're taking his word. We're now taking the husband's word that he notified Wallace Bradsher of this. Very interesting. Let's continue playing more of this SBI agent's testimony. And this is about to get really interesting because he's talking about how he actually sets up an appointment with Wallace Bradsher himself. I want to hear what Wallace Bradsher has to say to this SBI agent. Let's take a listen.
did not.
Okay, so this is very interesting. This is testimony, Vincent Hill, from David Whitley, who is with the North Carolina Bureau of Investigation. He does the public corruption investigation, and he was kind of the lead investigator here, looking into this alleged plot hatched, according to prosecutors, by Wallace Bradsher when he could no longer employ his wife. So he engineered, according to prosecutors, this scheme to swap wives with another prosecutor and have that other prosecutor's wife work for him. Turns out she didn't really do much working. Now, here's kind of what's interesting about this, I think, is that if you're listening to his testimony, from what I can tell, it sounds like they went to Craig Blitzer first, and they interviewed him first about what happened. As a former law enforcement officer, Vincent, does that shape your investigation, who you talk to first?
In certain cases, it definitely can, Rachel. I mean, you sometimes want to look who may be less culpable, who may be easier to reach out to. We don't know the circumstances of why they actually talked to Blitzer first. Maybe they got a hold of him first. I'm sure he was trying to make this contact at the same time. And as we know, Wallace didn't immediately return that phone call. He wasn't available when the investigator first reached out. So there could be several factors as to why they talked to Blitzer first. Maybe they got tipped off to something that, hey, this is the weakest link in this pizza scheme. So there's several factors that could have caused that.
But it is interesting that they did talk to him first, and, you know, obviously he's implying in his testimony, I guess, in his questioning, his answers to the questions by the FBI agent, he is really implying that, well, this was all really Wallace Bradsher's idea. So this guy who you see on the screen, Craig Blitzer, he was the other prosecutor. He ran for DA. He was concerned because this would mean a big pay cut, and he says to the FBI agent that I contacted Bradsher, and the Bradsher had this great idea. Well, you can kind of make up for that lost income by employing your wife.
And your wife, yeah. Which, you know, again, you heard him say that, you know, it violated policy for Blitzer to hire his own wife, which is why they did the entire wife swap thing. But you have to prove the intent here, that the intent was to steal this $48,000 and have no work done. That's the bigger issue.
Okay, so Vincent's going to stick around for a few more minutes. I want us to continue listening to this testimony because it's so important. But first, let's take a quick break. Okay, just listening very closely to that testimony of David Whitley. He's with the North Carolina Bureau of Investigation. He did the public corruption investigation into Wallace Bradsher, who's facing a slew of charges, including several felonies for his involvement in this alleged scheme to rip off the taxpayers and switch wives with another prosecutor, Craig Blitzer, and take on the employment of Craig Blitzer's wife, Cindy. And you were just hearing David Whitley talk about his interview with Craig Blitzer that he did. I'm here with Vincent Hill, one of our law and crime trial analysts and also a fellow host here on the network. Vincent, what do you make of what Craig Blitzer is telling this FBI agent?
Well, I mean, on the surface, it sounds like they knew exactly what they were doing when they concocted this plan to swap their wives. I mean, you hear testimony that he was worried about his salary. He wasn't going to make enough money. Oh, just hire your wife. Oh, and by the way, she wants to go to school. Don't worry about it. I can help her get in this class. So it sounds like the two knew exactly what they were doing when they concocted this scheme.
And again, not really going to one being more guilty than the other than Craig Blitzer really trying to tell the FBI agent, but it was all Bradsher's idea. He came up with all of this. He was already doing this with his wife before I even signed on. So, okay, let's talk a little bit, too, about the ADA Jay Stolt, who was tasked with supposedly approving Cindy Blitzer's time card. You have concerns with this? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, here's the thing, Rachel. If he was tasked to approve these time cards, this Jay Schultz, wouldn't he be part of this scheme? Because you would assume that he's checking to make sure she's done this work and that he's turning these time cards in good faith. So to suggest otherwise would mean he's involved with Wallace and Blitzer and he knows exactly what's going on. So shouldn't he be involved in this trial as well? Shouldn't he be a defendant, a co-defendant in this case?
And what about Cindy Blitzer? I mean, she knew all too well, and she testified to the fact that she knew what she was doing was not right in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if that's her testimony, then yeah, she should be involved in this as well. This Jay Schultz, if he or she was culpable in turning in these bogus time cards, then they should be involved in this case as well. And that's probably something the jury is thinking about because they've heard the name Jay Schultz. They've heard that he approved these time cards. So that's probably something the jury's thinking about.
Yeah, because it's the type of thing where the jurors do consider that. They're going to look at Cindy Blitzer and say, okay, wait a minute now. Yeah, maybe Bradsher knew about this, but you're just as guilty and you're getting off with nothing. And apparently the name, I had it wrong, was Jay Stultz, not Stult. So I apologize for that. But he is the guy that allegedly approved Cindy Blitzer's time cards. Let's continue, though, very quickly to listen to more of the testimony from that agent with the North Carolina Bureau of Investigation. Very interesting testimony because he actually interviewed both Craig Blitzer and Wallace Bradsher, who's the one that is facing these very serious charges. Let's continue to listen to his testimony. Okay, so that is kind of incriminating, Vincent, to Bradsher, because this SBI agent that we were just hearing from is testifying that in a conversation with Bradsher, he talks about having Cindy, his wife, vary her time. So, you know, make sure it's not all 8 to 5, 9 to 5, but that she's like a normal person and would come in a little late, would take vacation, would have a doctor's appointment. What do you make of that?
Well, if it's true, then there is some fraud going on here, right? I mean, it'd probably be fraud by misrepresentation, misrepresenting those hours that she did or didn't work, like saying it's sick time or saying it's vacation time or leave of absence. You can't do that, especially when it's a government position that is paid by taxpayer money. You just simply cannot do that, Rachel, to misrepresent your hours. Look no further than Nashville, Tennessee, where the former mayor there was essentially fired for the exact same thing for misrepresenting hours. You can't do that in a government office. It's just illegal and unethical.
And you can't do that in let me tell you something, in a private sector office, if your boss found out you were cheating your time card, not coming in on time, it doesn't sit well with jurors. People don't like that, and especially when you're talking about taxpayer money. You know, yeah, it was $48,000, which is not a huge salary in the scheme of things, but it's a lot of money.
It's a lot. It's at least enough where some people would say, I wish I did make $48,000 a year to essentially do nothing. So yeah, it's nothing to sneeze at.
Especially when you're allowed to go to school, find a different way to have a career path. Okay, so Vince, you're going to stick around with us for a few more minutes. Let's continue to listen to David Whitley. He's the SBI agent who investigated this public corruption case. Let's continue to listen to his testimony. Okay, so there you see, Vincent Hill, is the trouble in this case, in my mind, and I think the jurors might get hung up in, is the fact that there was an intermediary between Craig Blitzer's wife, Cindy Blitzer, and Wallace Bradsher. Okay, so Cindy Blitzer, in her testimony, and the SBI agent just testified this, said, "Oh, I need work. I'm not getting any work." But instead of telling Wallace Bradsher directly, or she claims she tried to, she went through her husband, who then talked to him, who then relayed. You know what I mean? So it's a little bit a game of telephone, and that's where this case falls apart a little bit to me. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, you know, she didn't contact him directly. So Wallace Bradsher could say I was so far removed from that. And there's no proof that he talked to Blitzer after these conversations with Blitzer and his wife. So we really don't know what happened there. But there was no direct contact between the wife and with Wallace Bradsher. And therein lies the problem.
And we have to believe Craig Blitzer's testimony, who got a deal with the state to testify against his old friend, Wallace Bradsher, who's on trial.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're led to believe, but, anybody could say, yeah, he said that to get the better deal. Doesn't necessarily mean that that is exactly what happened there. A lot of times it's just like a jailhouse snitch, right? Sometimes people don't trust jailhouse snitches because they have ulterior motives. They want a deal to get out of prison earlier or get time off their sentence. So just because Craig Blitzer says it doesn't mean it's absolutely necessarily 100% true.
All right, so next we have coming up Gail Peed, and she's the administrative assistant for attorney Wallace Bradsher, for the former prosecutor. And we all know that administrative assistants know all about what's going on in the office. We're going to take a quick break, Vincent. We'll be right back with that testimony. So she thought Cindy Blitzer worked from home, but she wasn't sure just what she was told. Vincent Hill is with me here on the line, a law and crime trial analyst. We're inside this case in North Carolina. Wallace Bradsher, he's on trial for these charges of public corruption in this wife-swapping case. What do you make of Gail Peed's testimony, Vincent?
Well, the fact that she didn't know whether Cindy worked from home or not, I think it's very telling. But again, it would go back to the policies of that office. Does that office allow you to work from home? Many companies in this country allow people to work from home because of gas prices or whatever. So, it would come down to if that is the policy of that department, of that office, whether she violated that policy. And that's where we would have these problems if she violated policy. We've heard testimony that she misrepresented her time card, so we've already heard that. So if she wasn't allowed to work from home and she did, then there's another issue in this case.
And the real question, Vincent, and I know we have to cut you loose, but is what did Bradsher know, when did he know it, and how far did he go in terms of orchestrating this whole plot? That is what the jurors have to decide. Vincent, as always, thank you so much for being on the network, and we'll see you when you're back here hosting on Friday.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Okay, we are now going to turn to another interesting case, and that is the case of Holly Bobo. She was last seen more than 7 years ago. She disappeared on the morning of April 13th, 2011. 3 years later, investigators made an arrest. This happened in Tennessee. Did they arrest the right man? Well, he was put on trial. We take a deep dive into that case. Take a listen.